But hope is not a plan, and nostalgia is not a strategy. And if we stand still during this rupture, we will surrender our future to others. My friends, technological change is accelerating. We can either shape our future with AI or let it control our destiny.
That line wasn't a speech. That was a declaration of war against complacency, against nostalgia, and against every political force telling Canadians to wait for yesterday to come back. Mark Carney just drew a line in the sand. The question is, who's standing on the wrong side of it? Pay close attention to this.
The world's changing. Not gradually, but suddenly. Yes, some are still in denial. Rather than starting on this journey, they're waiting for the past to return.
Before Carney gave you that gut punch line about hope and nostalgia, he opened with something far more calculated, a surgical diagnosis of Canada's political paralysis. The world's changing, not gradually but suddenly. That is not rhetoric. That is a central banker speaking in the language of economic shock doctrine. Mark Carney spent years at the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada watching slow-moving crises become catastrophic collapses. And he knows better than anyone in that room what it looks like when a country hesitates at the wrong moment. Some are still in denial. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. Every Canadian watching knew exactly who he was talking about. The forces of political conservatism anchored to a pre-tariff, pre-trade war, pre-Trump world that no longer exists. Carney is positioning himself not as a politician, but as the only adult in the room with the institutional credibility to navigate a rupture that most of Ottawa hasn't even admitted is happening. This opening salvo wasn't an accident, it was architected. And what comes next reveals just how deep this power play goes. Watch the crowd's reaction carefully, because Carney is reading them just as much as they are reading him.
And if we stand still during this rupture, we will surrender our future to others. My friends, technological change is accelerating. We can either shape our future with AI or let it control our destiny.
He said the word twice. Surrender. That was deliberate. In political oratory, repetition is a weapon, and Carney wielded it with the precision of someone who has testified before parliaments, briefed G7 finance ministers, and stared down currency crises without blinking. He is not talking about losing a trade negotiation. He is talking about civilizational positioning, where Canada sits in a world being redefined by artificial intelligence, by shifting supply chains, and by a United States that has become an unreliable partner under tariff warfare. We can either shape our future with AI or let it control our destiny. That line lands differently when you understand that Carney is not a career politician improvising on stage. He is a man who chaired the Financial Stability Board during the 2008 global financial crisis. He has seen what happens when nations are reactive rather than proactive, and he is telling Canadians with absolute clarity, the window to act is right now. This is the moment the speech shifts from political rally to something far more urgent, because what Carney says next isn't about the economy alone, it's about Canada's place in a world order that is actively fracturing, and he was there when the blueprints were drawn.
The foundations of the international order, the order which Canada helped build and from which we have benefited for so long, that order is crumbling. This is not the time for politics as usual.
Stop. Rewind that in your mind. The governor who steered two G7 central banks just told a room full of Canadians, on camera in plain language, that the international order is crumbling, not weakening, not shifting, crumbling. That is a statement of extraordinary consequence. The post-World War II architecture, the WTO, NATO's economic guarantees, the US-Canada trade relationship codified under CUSMA, all of it was built on assumptions that no longer hold. And Carney, uniquely among Canadian politicians, has the institutional biography to make that claim with authority. He didn't read about Bretton Woods in a textbook. He operated within its final functioning decades. What makes this moment politically explosive is the implicit accusation embedded in it. If the order is crumbling and this is not the time for politics as usual, then anyone offering politics as usual is not just wrong, they are dangerous. Carney is reframing the entire Canadian election not as a policy debate, but as a survival test, and he is positioning himself as the only candidate who has actually stood inside global power structures long enough to know how to rebuild them. The crowd erupted, but it's what he says next about unity that reveals the full strategy.
For petty differences, for political point scoring, united, we will build Canada strong. A Canada for all, a Canada strong that no one can ever take away.
Petty differences. Political point scoring. In the middle of what Carney has just described as a civilizational rupture, he is calling out the political class directly and doing it in front of a roaring crowd that is already on his side. This is the strategic masterstroke of this entire speech. By framing division itself as the enemy, Carney effectively inoculates himself against any criticism. Attack him on policy? That's political point scoring. Question his record? That's petty differences. It is a rhetorical architecture that former central bank governors know how to build, because they've spent careers making decisions that had to transcend partisan politics to be credible to markets. But here's what the analysts are missing. A Canada that no one can ever take away. That phrase is not directed at a domestic political opponent. That phrase is directed south of the border. It is a direct, unmistakable signal to a Trump administration that has floated, even jokingly, the idea of Canada as the 51st state. Carney is not laughing. He is drawing a constitutional and cultural boundary in the language of a man who has negotiated with the most powerful financial institutions on earth. The crowd heard a rally cry. The world heard a boundary being set.
Rather than starting on this journey, they're waiting for the past to return. Nope.
Watch that crowd reaction again. The moment Carney says they're waiting for the past to return, the room doesn't murmur, it doesn't politely applaud. It shouts no, spontaneously, collectively. That tells you everything about the emotional temperature of the Canadian electorate right now. Carney engineered that moment. This is a man who prepared central bank forward guidance, language so carefully calibrated that a single misplaced word could move currency markets by percentage points. He knew that line would land like that. He wrote it to land like that. The past he's referencing is coded language with layered meaning. The pre-tariff trading relationship with America, the Conservative Party's economic nostalgism, and the dangerous fantasy that Trump's trade aggression is temporary and will self-correct. Canada's goods exports to the United States represent approximately 75% of all Canadian exports. If that relationship has fundamentally changed, and Carney is telling you it has, then waiting for the past to return is not just politically naive, it is economically catastrophic. It is the equivalent of a central bank holding interest rates steady while inflation is already embedded. Carney has seen that movie, he has lived that movie, and he is refusing to let Canada sleepwalk into the sequel. The nostalgia trap is set, and his opponents are walking straight into it.
My friends, technological change is accelerating. We can either shape our future with AI or let it control our destiny. The foundations of the international order, the order which Canada helped build and from which we have benefited for so long, that order is crumbling.
By this point in the speech, Carney has done something no Canadian political leader has done in a generation. He has delivered three simultaneous arguments, stacked perfectly, each one amplifying the next. First, the world has broken. Second, technology will either serve Canada or consume it. Third, the architecture Canada relied on is gone. These are not three separate points. They are one argument delivered in three movements, like a central bank policy statement structured for maximum market impact. The Carney doctrine, if we can call it that, is essentially this. Canada must stop defining itself in relation to the United States and start building sovereign capability across technology, trade diversification, and international alliance structures. This is not abstract. In the past 18 months, Canada has deepened trade conversations with the European Union, accelerated CPTPP partnerships with Indo-Pacific nations, and increased defense spending commitments within NATO. Carney is not proposing this vision. He is describing a transition already in motion and claiming the mandate to complete it. Every word of this speech is directed at one audience, the undecided Canadian voter who is frightened but hasn't yet found the leader who feels big enough for the moment. Carney is making his case that he is that leader. The final analysis will tell you whether he's right and what the stakes truly are. What you have just witnessed is not a campaign speech. It is the opening move in a calculated geopolitical repositioning of Canada itself. Delivered by a man who spent 2 decades inside the engine rooms of global finance before most Canadian politicians had ever read a central bank quarterly report. And if you think the words "hope is not a plan" and "nostalgia is not a strategy" were aimed at a domestic political rival, you are watching the wrong chess match entirely, because Mark Carney is not playing Canadian politics right now. He is playing a game whose board stretches from Washington to Brussels to Beijing, and every single line of that speech was architected with the precision of a forward guidance statement designed to move not just public opinion, but the expectations of allies, adversaries, and financial markets simultaneously. The hidden power play here is not between Carney and Pierre Poilievre. It is between Carney and a White House that has spent the better part of 2 years treating Canada as a subordinate economy to be pressured, cajoled, and ultimately absorbed into an American economic orbit through tariff warfare and rhetorical provocations about statehood, and Carney, who sat across tables from the most powerful central bankers on earth during the 2008 financial collapse, who guided sterling through the Brexit shock, who has watched nationalist economic populism hollow out institutions from the inside. Carney understands with forensic clarity that the Trump administration's aggression toward Canada is not a negotiating tactic, it is a structural realignment, and you cannot negotiate your way out of a structural realignment. You can only build sovereign resilience or surrender to dependency, which is precisely why that word, surrender, appeared twice, placed like a detonator inside a sentence designed to make every Canadian in that room feel the weight of the choice in front of them. The audience sentiment emerging from clips like this across Canadian social media is overwhelmingly a cocktail of galvanized fear and cautious hope. Canadians are frightened in a way that feels different from previous election cycles, not the abstract fear of policy disagreement, but the visceral economic fear of people who watched their southern neighbours' government place 25% tariffs on Canadian goods and genuinely wondered whether the relationship that underwrote Canadian prosperity for 80 years had just been cancelled without notice. And into that fear, Carney steps not with reassurance, but with diagnosis, which is the more powerful political move, because reassurance can be dismissed as spin, but diagnosis forces acknowledgement of reality, and the reality Carney is naming, that the international order Canada helped build is crumbling, finds a direct historical parallel in 1971, when Nixon's unilateral suspension of the Bretton Woods gold standard dismantled a post-war financial architecture overnight and forced every allied nation to reckon with the fact that American economic power, when threatened, would be wielded against friends as readily as adversaries, and Canada, then as now, had to decide in real time whether to anchor itself to American gravity or begin diversifying the foundations of its economic sovereignty, and the leaders who chose diversification in that era, who accelerated European trade relationships, who invested in domestic industrial capacity, who refused to treat American preferences as Canadian policy. Those are the leaders history remembered as visionary, while those who waited for the old relationship to restore itself were left stranded when it never did. On the global stage right now, the timing of this speech intersects with a moment of extraordinary consequence. Canada's allies in the G7 are watching Ottawa with the kind of attention they usually reserve for crises, because a Canada that breaks from reflexive continental alignment and steps into a more assertive global leadership posture changes the calculus for European defence cooperation, for Indo-Pacific trade architecture, and for the credibility of multilateral institutions that the United States is actively undermining. And Carney, as the former chair of the Financial Stability Board and the man who helped design post-crisis regulatory frameworks that still govern global banking, carries institutional legitimacy in those conversations that no other Canadian political figure can claim, which is why this speech should be understood not merely as a domestic campaign event, but as a signal broadcast outward, a message to Berlin and Paris and Tokyo and Ottawa's CPTPP partners that Canada is preparing to step into the vacuum that American retreat from multilateralism has created, and that the person who will lead that transition has the biography, the relationships, and the analytical framework to make it credible. The lingering question that should keep every Canadian voter awake tonight is this. In a world where the old order is genuinely crumbling, and the most powerful nation on earth has decided to treat its closest ally as a competitor to be contained, does Canada have the institutional courage, the economic imagination, and the political will to build something new before the window closes? Subscribe, share this video, and drop your answer in the comments below, because that question doesn't get answered in Ottawa, it gets answered by you.